When you spend years working in energy regulation, studying the rules, shaping policies, and helping homeowners understand their rights, you think you've seen it all, but nothing really prepares you for the moment when the fight comes right to your own doorstep. I never imagined that one day I would be battling with my own homeowners association, the very people who are supposed to maintain the neighborhood, not dictate personal choices about how I power my home. Yet there I was, staring at a letter that told me my solar panels had to come down. They weren't just making a suggestion, they were demanding it. The letter was cold, official, almost threatening. To most people, that kind of notice would spark fear, confusion, or compliance. But to me, it triggered something else, because they had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't just another homeowner who could be bullied into giving up. I was an energy regulator. I knew the rules, and I knew they were wrong. It started innocently enough. I had installed solar panels on my roof after years of encouraging others to do the same. I believed in clean energy, in saving money, in reducing dependence on the grid, and most of all, I believed in setting an example. My panels were perfectly legal, permitted, inspected, and operating exactly as they should. They weren't an eyesore. In fact, several neighbors had complimented them, asking how much I was saving each month. The sun was literally paying part of my mortgage. But apparently, that kind of independence doesn't sit well with people who crave control. My HOA sent the notice claiming my panels violated aesthetic guidelines. They said the shiny panels disrupted the uniform look of the neighborhood and gave the community an industrial feel. I almost laughed when I read it because it was the weakest excuse I had ever heard. But then I realized this wasn't just about looks. This was about power. Most homeowners would panic at the thought of fighting their HOA. After all, HOAs are notorious for their strict rules, endless fines, and intimidating legal threats. They bank on the idea that people will just roll over to avoid conflict. But I had spent years drafting and reviewing energy policies at the state level. I knew that federal and state laws protected solar energy rights. I knew the HOA's demand had no legal foundation. And most of all, I knew that this wasn't just my battle. It was a test of how far they could push homeowners before someone pushed back. The next HOA meeting was tense. They expected me to come quietly, maybe plead for an exception, maybe offer to hide the panels or compromise in some way. Instead, I walked in with a binder full of statutes, case law, and regulatory rulings. The room grew quiet as I laid it on the table. I calmly explained that state solar access laws specifically prohibited HOAs from banning or unreasonably restricting solar panels. I pointed out that their own bylaws made no mention of renewable energy restrictions. And then I told them who I was, not just a homeowner, but an energy regulator. The looks on their faces were priceless. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others suddenly avoided eye contact. They weren't expecting resistance, much less from someone who knew more about the law than their own attorney. Still, they weren't ready to back down. One board member, clearly flustered, said the panels reflected light into other homes and posed a nuisance. Another muttered about property values dropping if solar panels spread through the neighborhood. That's when I leaned forward and dropped the hook. I told them not only were their arguments baseless, but if they pursued this, they could be facing legal consequences for violating homeowner energy rights. I explained that I had friends in regulatory offices who would be very interested in seeing how this HOA was trying to undermine clean energy initiatives. The room went dead silent. They realized this wasn't just about one homeowner anymore. This was about exposing their abuse of power. But here's the thing. The fight didn't end in that room. They thought intimidation would work, and when it didn't, they doubled down. I began receiving warning letters about supposed maintenance violations. Suddenly, they were inspecting my lawn weekly, sending me notices about weeds that didn't exist, cracks in the driveway that were imaginary, even claiming my mailbox was non-compliant. It was obvious retaliation. They wanted to make me so miserable that I'd give in. But every letter they sent only strengthened my resolve. Because now I knew the truth. They weren't just targeting me. They were setting an example for everyone else in the community. If they could crush me, then no one else would dare challenge them. And that was something I couldn't allow. Neighbors started noticing the pressure I was under. Some whispered to me in passing, saying they admired what I was doing but were too afraid to speak up. Others asked if I could help them with their own disputes with the HOA. I realized I had become a symbol of resistance. And that's when I knew I had to take this all the way. This wasn't just about my solar panels anymore. This was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied, every family that felt trapped under the thumb of a power-hungry HOA board. I was going to fight back, and I was going to win. What happened next was a turning point, not just in my battle, but in the way the entire neighborhood viewed the HOA. And it started with one move they never expected from me. The move they never expected from me wasn't aggression. It was precision. Instead of yelling at meetings or firing back with angry letters, I began documenting everything. Every notice they sent, every fine they threatened, every interaction I had with board members. It all went into a growing file. I knew that if this ever reached a courtroom, details would matter. And while they thought they were building a case against me, I was quietly building one against them. What they didn't realize was that I had an advantage they could never match. I understood how regulatory bodies worked. I knew which agencies oversaw homeowner rights, how complaints were processed, and which state departments tracked renewable energy disputes. I also knew something the HOA didn't want me to bring up. The state had recently passed legislation expanding protections for solar access. It wasn't just about homeowners being allowed to install panels. It was about HOAs being prohibited from retaliation, fines, or harassment connected to renewable energy. That meant every bogus violation notice they sent me wasn't just petty, it was potentially illegal. At first, I didn't let them see what I was planning. I kept attending meetings, calmly challenging their claims, smiling while they grew increasingly frustrated. They were trying to provoke me, but I refused to give them the satisfaction. Inside, though, I was preparing a storm they couldn't escape. Because I knew one well-documented complaint could trigger an investigation, and once that investigation started, it wouldn't just stop with me, it would expose their entire operation. Then came the breaking point. They issued a formal demand, threatening daily fines if I didn't remove my solar panels within 30 days. They had escalated from harassment to outright financial punishment. And that's when I knew the time for quiet patience was over. I sent them a response letter, not as a homeowner, but as a professional regulator. In clear, unmistakable language, I cited state solar access laws, energy statutes, and homeowner protection clauses. I informed them that their actions not only violated state law, but could expose them to regulatory enforcement and civil liability. I copied the letter to the State Attorney General's office and the Department of Energy Resources. It was a warning shot, but also a declaration. I wasn't playing defense anymore. The board members were rattled. You could see it in their faces at the next meeting. For the first time, they realized this wasn't a simple power struggle they could win by intimidation. Still, instead of backing down, they tried to save face. Their lawyer, clearly scrambling, showed up and tried to twist the issue into a matter of neighborhood cohesion and aesthetic integrity. But when I asked him to point to a single law that allowed an HOA to override state solar rights, he couldn't. He danced around the question, shifted topics, even raised his voice. The room full of homeowners watched silently as their lawyer failed to answer the simplest demand: show us the law. That was my hook, the moment that shifted the energy in the room. Neighbors who had been silent started whispering. People began looking at me differently, not as a troublemaker, but as someone fighting for their freedom too. And that was dangerous for the HOA, because their power relied on fear and silence. If people saw me win, they might start standing up for themselves too. The days that followed were tense. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox, warning me to drop it before things get worse. A couple of board members avoided me completely, while others glared whenever I passed by. It was intimidation, pure and simple. But the more they tried to silence me, the more determined I became. I wasn't just defending my solar panels anymore. I was defending the principle that no one should be bullied into submission by a group of neighbors hiding behind rules. So I escalated. I filed a formal complaint with the State Regulatory Commission. I submitted every letter, every fine notice, every photograph of my panels that they had used against me. I attached my correspondence showing how I had informed them of the law and how they had ignored it. And then I waited. Weeks passed, and the tension in the neighborhood grew thick. People knew something was coming, though most didn't know what. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived, not from the HOA this time, but from the State Energy Regulatory Office. They had opened a formal investigation into the HOA's practices, and suddenly, everything changed. The same board that had been so bold, so aggressive, now looked panicked. They called an emergency meeting, trying to spin the situation as a misunderstanding. They claimed they had been unaware of the new laws, that they were only enforcing community guidelines. But the truth was out. They had overstepped. And now the state was watching. I could have ended it there. I could have accepted their retreat, kept my panels, and moved on. But by then, I knew it wasn't enough. Because if I stopped, they'd simply regroup, wait a few months, and then target someone else. I wanted accountability. I wanted everyone to see the full extent of their abuse. So when the investigator contacted me, I didn't hold back. I explained everything, from the first notice to the bogus violations to the lawyer's attempt to misrepresent the law. I told them about the neighbors who were too afraid to speak up, about the harassment that went beyond rules and into intimidation. And I emphasized one point. This wasn't about me. It was about an HOA that thought it was untouchable. The investigation began to widen. Inspectors started asking questions, not just about my panels, but about other HOA practices. Financial, transparency, board elections, fine structures. Suddenly, everything was under scrutiny. The board had tried to break me with pressure. Instead, they had opened a door they couldn't close. And that's when I realized I wasn't just in a fight with my HOA anymore. I was in the middle of something much bigger, because this case wasn't just going to determine whether I kept my solar panels. It was going to decide whether homeowners across the state had to live in fear of HOA boards or whether they could finally push back and win. The question was, how far was I willing to take it? They thought the fight would end there, that maybe I would cave after they realized the panels weren't coming down. But that was only the beginning. What they didn't know was that every step they took against me only made their case weaker. Because I wasn't just some homeowner trying to play lawyer, I was the regulator. The very system they thought they could manipulate, I had spent years designing, overseeing, and protecting. I remember the next board meeting vividly. They gathered in that cramped little room with their papers and stiff faces, like they were about to pass down a royal decree. I walked in, calm, collected, and very prepared. One of them cleared his throat and said, "We've consulted legal counsel, and the association has authority over external modifications. That means your solar panels are subject to removal." He said it with that smug certainty of someone who thinks they've won before the game even starts. I leaned forward, pulled a folder from my bag, and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of the state energy laws, federal energy protections, and case rulings where HOAs had been overruled. My voice stayed steady as I said, "Actually, you don't have that authority. State law specifically prevents associations from unreasonably restricting solar access. And unless you want to end up on the losing side of a very public legal case, I suggest you reconsider this position." The room went quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe they'd back down. But pride is a powerful thing. Instead of accepting defeat, they doubled down. They claimed the panels were a safety hazard, that they posed risks to the neighborhood's aesthetics, that they were somehow offensive to the community image. It was nonsense, and we all knew it, but they wanted to wear me down. What they didn't realize is that I wasn't fighting just for myself anymore. Word had gotten out. Neighbors started asking questions. Some whispered their support in private. Others admitted they'd wanted solar too, but had been scared off by the HOA's strict rules. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one roof. It was about an entire community being controlled by a handful of people who thought they could bend the rules for their own comfort. The turning point came one evening when I found a notice taped to my door. In bold letters it read, "Final warning. Failure to remove the solar panels within 14 days will result in fines and legal action." I stood there, holding that paper, and I realized this was the moment they thought they'd break me. But instead, it fueled me. I picked up the phone, called a contact of mine at the state's energy department, and within days, the HOA had a letter on their desk. It wasn't from me this time. It was from the state, and it made things very clear. Their attempts to force removal of my solar panels were illegal, unenforceable, and a direct violation of energy access laws. That was the first domino to fall. From there, the balance shifted. The HOA's confidence began to crumble. They couldn't explain why they were spending the association's money chasing a losing battle. Neighbors started showing up at meetings, demanding answers. I sat quietly, watching as their own members turned against them, not because I asked them to, but because they could see the truth for themselves. Then came the real twist. The energy company got involved. They'd been monitoring the dispute, and when they saw how the HOA was acting, they sent a representative to the next meeting. She stood up in front of everyone and explained how solar adoption was not just protected, but actively encouraged, and how the HOA's behavior could put the entire community in violation of broader state energy goals. By the time she finished, the board members looked like they'd swallowed bitter medicine. Still, they resisted. Pride is stubborn. But each time they tried to push back, I pushed harder, with facts, with laws, with the very authority I was sworn to uphold. I never shouted, never threatened. I simply reminded them that the rules they were trying to twist were rules I enforced every single day at a state level. The final blow came not from me, but from their own lawyer. After months of wasting resources, he told them bluntly, "You cannot win this. Continuing this fight will bankrupt the association." And just like that, they folded. I wish I could say it ended with an apology, that they admitted they were wrong. But power doesn't humble that easily. Instead, they quietly sent me a letter. "The board has decided to cease pursuing enforcement actions regarding your solar panels." It was their way of conceding without admitting defeat. And honestly, that was enough. But here's the thing. The story didn't just end with my victory. Something bigger happened. The neighbors who had once stayed silent began asking about solar installations of their own. The community realized they had more rights than they'd been led to believe. And slowly, the grip of the HOA weakened. That's when I understood something important. This fight was never really about panels. It was about power. Who gets to decide how we live, and whether people are allowed to take control of their own homes, their own energy, their own future. The HOA thought they could cancel me, erase my choices, make me small. Instead, they ended up exposing their own limits. And the best part? Every time I look at those panels now, soaking up the sun, I don't just see lower bills or clean energy. I see proof. Proof that sometimes standing your ground, even when it feels impossible, changes more than just your own story. It sparks something bigger. So when people ask me how I managed to take on an HOA and win, I tell them the truth. I didn't just defend my panels. I defended my right to decide, and I reminded them that no one cancels the regulator, because in the end, the sun always wins.